It was supposed to be just another peaceful Saturday afternoon, the kind that made suburban life seem like the perfect place to raise a child. The sun cast a warm glow over the neighborhood, illuminating the neatly manicured lawns and the rows of almost identical houses lining the street. I had just settled down on my porch with a book and a cup of coffee, relishing the rare moment of peace as my 10-year-old son, Ethan, rode his bike up and down the sidewalk. His laughter filled the air, pure and unbothered, as he chased after a small rubber ball he had been playing with earlier. It was the kind of innocent fun every child should be allowed to have. Simple, carefree, and harmless. Little did I know that the tranquility of that moment was about to be shattered. The first sign of trouble came when I noticed the all-too-familiar figure of our neighbor, Karen, stepping onto her porch. Even from a distance, I could see the scowl plastered on her face, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she zeroed in on Ethan with an expression of barely contained irritation. Karen had always been a nuisance, one of those neighbors who seemed to take pleasure in nitpicking over the most trivial issues. Whether it was a minor parking infraction, a misplaced trash can, or the simple sound of children playing, she always found something to complain about. I tried to ignore her as she stood there, tapping her foot impatiently, but it quickly became clear that she wasn't going to let this one slide. She stormed off her porch and marched directly toward Ethan, her short blonde bob swaying with every angry step. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice shrill and demanding. "This is getting out of hand. The noise is unbearable." Ethan, startled, skidded his bike to a stop, his face scrunching up in confusion. I'm just playing," he said hesitantly. Karen let out a dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes as if my son had just personally offended her. "This is a neighborhood, not a playground. You're disturbing the peace, young man." By then, I had already put my book down and was making my way across the yard. "Karen, what's the problem here?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "The problem," she huffed, turning to glare at me, "is that your kid has been making a racket all afternoon. People are trying to enjoy their homes in peace, and all I hear is that bike screeching and that ball bouncing all over the place." I blinked, taken aback by the sheer absurdity of her complaint. "Karen, he's just riding his bike and playing with a ball. He's not screaming, he's not breaking anything, and he's not even on your property." Karen scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "It doesn't matter. The sound is grating. Some of us value peace and quiet, and I have every right to enjoy my home without this nonsense." At that moment, Ethan looked up at me, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. I could tell he was confused, maybe even a little scared, and that was what angered me the most. He wasn't doing anything wrong, yet here he was being scolded as if he had committed some kind of crime. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "Karen, with all due respect, this is a neighborhood, and kids are going to play outside. If you have a problem with normal, everyday sounds, maybe you should consider moving somewhere more secluded." Her lips thinned into a tight line, and for a brief moment, I thought she might actually storm off. Instead, she exhaled sharply and pulled out her phone. "Fine," she said, her voice cold with determination. "If you won't do something about it, then I will." And with that, she turned away and began dialing a number. It took me a second to register what was happening, and when I did, my stomach dropped. "Wait, are you seriously calling the police?" I asked, incredulous. Karen didn't even glance at me as she pressed the phone to her ear. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said smoothly. "A young boy is causing an ongoing nuisance in the neighborhood, disrupting everyone's peace." Yes, right now. I stood there in stunned silence, unable to believe what I was witnessing. Ethan's eyes widened with alarm as he turned to me for reassurance. I wanted to tell him everything was fine, that this was just some ridiculous misunderstanding, but the truth was, I had no idea how this was going to play out. Within minutes, a police car pulled up to the curb, its presence instantly drawing the attention of other neighbors. A couple of them stepped out onto their porches, whispering among themselves, their faces filled with curiosity and concern. Two officers emerged from the vehicle, their expressions neutral but observant as they took in the scene before them. "Is there a problem here?" one of the officers asked, stepping forward. Karen wasted no time launching into her exaggerated tale. "Yes, officer, there absolutely is. This child has been out here, making an unbearable amount of noise for hours, disturbing everyone in the neighborhood. I tried to ask the parent to handle it, but they refused, so I had no choice but to call you. I immediately stepped forward, my heart pounding. Officer, my son was simply playing outside. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't damaging property. He was just riding his bike and playing with a ball. This is completely ridiculous." The officers exchanged glances before turning to Ethan, who looked more nervous than I had ever seen him. One of them crouched down slightly, offering him a reassuring smile. "Hey, buddy, can you tell me what you were doing before we got here?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. I was just playing. I didn't know I was doing something bad." The sight of my son looking so unsure of himself made my blood boil. He had done nothing wrong. Yet here he was, being treated like a troublemaker because of one woman's entitled sense of superiority. One officer turned back to Karen, his tone measured but firm. "Ma'am, unless this child was doing something dangerous or illegal, there's nothing we can do. Kids are allowed to play outside." Karen's face twisted with frustration. "So you're just going to ignore a noise complaint?" The officer sighed. "Ma'am, we handle actual disturbances. A child playing outside doesn't qualify." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But before she could say anything else, the officer turned to me. "Sir, your son is free to continue playing. Have a good day." With that, they got back into their patrol car, leaving Karen standing there, her face red with humiliation and rage. But something told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the aftermath of the police visit, I had foolishly believed that Karen would take the officer's response as a clear sign to back off. After all, she had just embarrassed herself in front of the entire neighborhood, proving to everyone that she was willing to weaponize law enforcement over something as trivial as a child playing outside. Surely, that level of public humiliation would be enough to make her rethink her approach. I was wrong. If anything, the incident seemed to ignite something even more spiteful in her. In the days following the ordeal, I started to notice small but intentional acts of pettiness. It started with Karen standing on her porch every time Ethan went outside, watching him with the cold, scrutinizing gaze of a hawk surveying its prey. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there with her arms folded, making her presence known. It was unsettling, and I could tell it was making Ethan nervous. He started hesitating before going outside, glancing toward her house as if expecting another confrontation. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I saw Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, her phone held up at an odd angle. It took me a second to realize what she was doing. She was recording Ethan. I felt my stomach twist with anger. "Karen, what the hell are you doing?" I demanded, stepping toward her. She barely flinched, lowering the phone just slightly as she fixed me with a smug, self-righteous expression. "Gathering evidence," she said simply. I scoffed. "Evidence of what?" "A kid playing outside." She let out a condescending chuckle. "You see, I knew this was going to be a problem when you moved in. Some of us actually care about maintaining a certain standard in this neighborhood. And if I have to prove that your child is a constant disruption, then so be it." I clenched my fists, my patience wearing dangerously thin. "You need to stop this, Karen. You're harassing my son. He's 10 years old. He has every right to be outside just like anyone else." Karen tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with false sympathy. "Oh, I'm not harassing anyone. I'm simply documenting. And when the time comes, I'll have more than enough proof to take this further." I had no idea what she meant by "take this further," but I knew it wasn't good. And I was right. Over the next week, she escalated her tactics. She started filing official noise complaints against us with the Homeowners Association, claiming that Ethan was being a public nuisance. The first notice arrived in my mailbox on a Monday morning, printed on official HOA letterhead. It stated that there had been multiple reports of excessive noise disturbances coming from my property, and that I needed to ensure that my child remained quiet during reasonable hours. I was furious. I stormed over to the HOA office that same afternoon, letter in hand, demanding to know who had filed the complaints. The receptionist gave me a tight-lipped smile and informed me that all reports were anonymous. But I didn't need confirmation. I knew exactly who was behind it. The complaints didn't stop there. Every other day, a new notice would arrive. One claiming that Ethan's bike riding was a safety concern. Another accusing him of causing distress to residents with his supposed unruly behavior. It was absurd. My son was one of the quietest, most well-behaved kids I knew, yet Karen was painting him as some kind of delinquent terrorizing the neighborhood. The stress was beginning to take a toll on Ethan. He became noticeably withdrawn, spending more and more time indoors. He no longer rode his bike as freely as he used to, and he even stopped bouncing his ball against the sidewalk, something he used to do absent-mindedly while daydreaming. It broke my heart to see my happy, carefree kid second-guessing every movement, afraid that just existing outside would get him in trouble. Then came the legal threat. One evening after dinner, there was a sharp knock on my front door. I opened it to find Karen standing there with a folder in hand, her expression sickeningly smug. "What do you want now?" I asked, already exhausted by her presence. She held out the folder. "Consider this your official warning." I hesitated before taking it. The second I flipped it open, my breath caught in my throat. A cease and desist letter. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, flipping through the pages. The document, filled with legal jargon, accused me of knowingly allowing a minor to create an ongoing public disturbance, and stated that if I did not take immediate action to prevent Ethan from being a nuisance, she would seek legal recourse. I looked up at her, a disbelieving laugh escaping my lips. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," she said, her eyes glinting with malice. "I've consulted with my lawyer, and I'm prepared to take this to court if necessary. You're threatening to sue me over my kid playing outside?" Karen shrugged. "If that's what it takes to maintain order around here, then yes." I felt my entire body go rigid with anger. This had gone beyond petty complaints and passive-aggressive tactics. She was actively trying to bully my child out of his own home. "You're out of your mind," I said through gritted teeth. She smirked. "We'll see." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, gripping the ridiculous legal document in my hands. That night, I sat down with Ethan and tried my best to reassure him. I told him that he wasn't doing anything wrong, that he had every right to be outside, and that no matter what Karen did, I wasn't going to let her win. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was just a kid. He didn't understand the politics of entitled neighbors and HOA power plays. All he knew was that every time he tried to have fun, someone was trying to take it away from him. That was when I knew I couldn't just ignore this anymore. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't going to stop until she got her way. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't backing down either. If she wanted to fight, then fine, I'd give her one. But I wasn't going to fight dirty like she was. I was going to do things the right way. And that started with gathering my own evidence. The next morning, I reached out to a few neighbors, people I had spoken with over the years who I knew weren't as easily swayed by Karen's self-righteous antics. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one who had been on the receiving end of her complaints. Several neighbors had their own stories. She had tried to get one family fined for excessive lawn decorations, another for leaving their garbage cans out too long. She had even filed complaints about someone's dog barking, despite the fact that the dog in question had passed away months prior. "She does this to everyone," one neighbor told me. "She thinks she owns the place." That was all I needed to hear. I wasn't just dealing with a nosy neighbor. I was dealing with a full-blown menace. And it was time to put a stop to it. I wasn't going to let Karen win. Not this time. Not after she had turned my son's childhood into a legal battlefield, treating his right to play outside like a criminal offense. She had pushed too far, and I was done playing defense. It was time to fight back. The first thing I did was start documenting everything. Every single time she stepped onto her porch to glare at Ethan, I took note of the time. Every time she recorded him, I recorded her. Every HOA complaint she sent, I kept. Every interaction, every instance of her harassing us, I logged it all. If she wanted to play this game, I was going to make sure I had an ironclad case when I took my next step. Then I got the neighbors involved. At first, I had been hesitant to drag other people into this mess. It wasn't their battle, and I didn't want to burden them. But as I spoke to more of them, I realized that Karen's reign of terror had stretched far beyond just my family. The more I asked around, the more stories I uncovered. She had tried to get a neighbor fined for unsightly gardening because they had wildflowers in their yard instead of the uniform green grass she deemed acceptable. She had reported another neighbor's teenage son for playing music in his garage at 4 p.m. She had even called the police on a black family that had moved in 2 streets over, claiming they were suspicious simply for sitting on their own porch. This wasn't about noise. This wasn't about community standards. This was about control. Karen wanted everything around her to fit her impossible standard of suburban perfection, and anyone who didn't comply became her personal target. That's when I knew I wasn't just standing up for Ethan. I was standing up for the entire neighborhood. With the help of a few fed-up residents, I compiled an official harassment complaint and submitted it to the HOA board. I didn't expect much from them. The board had a history of being useless when it came to real problems, but I wanted it on record. Then, I took it a step further. I filed a police report against Karen for harassment. At first, I wasn't sure the police would take me seriously. After all, it wasn't like she had committed a violent crime. But I had something most people didn't when dealing with entitled neighbors. Evidence. Mountains of it. I showed them the footage of her recording Ethan. I provided copies of every ridiculous HOA complaint she had filed. I gave them statements from multiple neighbors, all confirming that she had been harassing various families for years. The officer at the station listened carefully, flipping through the stack of documents I handed him. When he finally looked up at me, he nodded. This is more than enough to move forward with an investigation. Those were the words I had been waiting to hear. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to the local news. I had a friend who worked at a community newspaper, and after explaining the situation, she agreed to cover the story. Within a week, an article was published online titled, "Suburban Nightmare." When a neighbor's complaints turned into harassment, the article detailed Karen's history of targeting families with her petty grievances, including our own situation with Ethan. It didn't take long for the story to spread. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent now felt emboldened to speak out. The comments section of the article exploded with people sharing their own encounters with Karen, many of them from people who didn't even live in our neighborhood, but had dealt with similar self-appointed rule enforcers. Karen must have seen the article, because the next day, she showed up at my house. She wasn't smug this time. She wasn't condescending. She was furious. "You had no right to do that," she shrieked the moment I opened the door. I crossed my arms. "Oh, you mean publicly calling out your harassment? Funny. You had no problem making a spectacle out of my son." Her face turned red. "This is slander. I could sue you for defamation." I laughed. "Go ahead. Everything in that article is backed up by facts. Besides, I thought you liked calling lawyers. Maybe they'll tell you what actual harassment looks like." Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to find the right words. But for once, she was speechless. Then, as if things couldn't get worse for her, a police car pulled up to my house. She stiffened. What are they doing here?" I smiled. "I filed a harassment report against you. The police found my evidence compelling enough to investigate. her face drained of color. The officer who stepped out of the car was the same one who had responded to her initial call about Ethan playing outside. He walked up the driveway and nodded at me before turning to Karen. "Ma'am, we need to have a conversation about the multiple reports of harassment filed against you," he said, his voice firm but professional. Karen stumbled backward. "This is ridiculous. I was just trying to maintain order in the neighborhood." The officer gave her a long, unimpressed look. "By stalking a child with a camera? By filing false noise complaints? By attempting to intimidate multiple residents? I was just following community guidelines. Ma'am, if you continue this behavior, you could be facing legal consequences." That was the final nail in the coffin. Karen was officially defeated. Over the next few weeks, she completely withdrew from public view. She stopped filing complaints. She stopped standing on her porch. She even stopped making passive-aggressive Facebook posts in the neighborhood group. It was as if she had finally realized that she wasn't the queen of the community after all. And as for Ethan, the first time he stepped outside to play again without looking over his shoulder, I knew we had won. The sound of his laughter filled the air, free and unburdened, the way it should have been all along. Justice had been served. And Karen, well, she eventually put her house up for sale. I guess she finally found a place that met her impossible standards. And good riddance.